Hello and welcome to our presentation this evening, Eerie, Muncie, the sequel. I am Sara, Allison, Head of Archives User Engagement in the Archives and Special Collections Department in the University Libraries. This is a community collaboration between the Ball State University Libraries, Delaware County Historical Society, Minnetrista, and the Muncie Public Library. Our presentation this evening, along with the question and answer portion, is being recorded and will be made available through the Ball State University Library's digital media repository. As a disclaimer, this program includes content that is meant for a mature audience, as it contains some disturbing content, and it is meant for a PG-13 audience. So first things first, we have some housekeeping rules. You are free to have your video on, but given the number of participants, it would help with the bandwidth for videos to be turned off. For the time being, we have muted everyone and asked that you stay muted throughout the presentation. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation and at the end of each section. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat. The button to access the chats is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. When using the chat box, please make sure that the to field is labeled to everyone. This way, all participants can see the question. If you wish to ask your question verbally, we will ask that you raise your hand. This function is also in the toolbar under the reaction button and located at the bottom of the options. So right now, very quickly, I'm just going to ask that anyone who can is able to enter into the chat that they can hear and see our presentation slides. I've got several yeses, so to me that means we can move on forward. So let's do some introductions. As I mentioned, I am Sara, Allison, Head of Archives User Engagement at Ball State University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, and I will be your moderator. This evening, we will be hearing from Melissa Gentry, who is the supervisor in the GIS research and map collection at Ball State University Libraries. Nalleli Guillen is the associate director of curation and exhibitions at Minnetrista and is joining our presentation group for the first time this evening. Also, we have Sara McKinley, who is the local history and genealogy supervisor of the Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library. And we have Vincent, who is the Delaware County historian and president of the Delaware County Historical Society. So let's please give them all a virtual round of applause. Yay. So during this time of year, we hear stories of hauntings and ghosts, like the legend of Elliott Hall's resident ghost here at Ball State. According to an article in the Evening Press in October of 1986, the story of World War II veteran William Schamberg has fueled this story. Quote, the legend has it that William returned to the university following the war. He had been disfigured and disabled in battle and was shunned by his fellow students. Following Christmas break, specifically on January 26, 1947, William climbed the marble steps to the library on Elliott's north end. There he took his own life. Now, Robert Linson, vice president of university relations, and a gentleman who was also a returning veteran at the same time, mentioned that no such student or event took place. According to the Evening Press, no university record, Delaware County Health Office records, or veteran service records mention a William Schamberg, either serving during World War II or returning as a student to Ball State. Makes one think that maybe the last name Schamberg is a farce in itself. In last year's inaugural Eerie Muncie Tales from the Dark Side program, scary stories were shared about hauntings, murders, and even the weird practice of eating sand. If you missed it or would like to relive the dark tales, the video is available on the Ball State University Library's digital media repository via YouTube. And back by popular demand, we have Eerie Muncie the sequel, with more dark tales from Muncie and Delaware County history. This year is no different. We have tales of drugs, dead bodies, UFOs, and monsters from the beyond. So to start this evening of Dark Tales with a Scream, we have Melissa Gentry.
Thanks, Sarah. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. In world history and culture, the era from 1880 to the beginning of World War I was known as the Belle Epoque, or the Beautiful Age. It was a time of unprecedented progress and prosperity. In Muncie, we call it the gas boom era, when natural gas flambeaux lit the streets of the Magic City. But the reality, especially for women during this time, reveals a very dark side of history. It was during this beautiful age that an ugly drug crisis was happening. Next slide. During this time in history, women were addicted to opiates. A late 19th century survey revealed that 60 to 70% of the morphine addicts in America were women, and it wasn't the stereotype that you would think of. Notably, in Chicago, fewer than 1/3 of the addicted women were prostitutes. The drug addicts were predominantly white women from the middle and upper classes. The most common occupation was that of a housewife. But unmarried teachers, actresses, circus performers, even social reformers and nurses were also addicted. Doctors prescribed morphine to women for, quote, female troubles, nervousness, depression. David Courtwright wrote in his book, Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America, that morphine could cure little, but relieve anything. Poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, quote, "It may strike you as strange that I, who have had no pain, no acute suffering, should need opium, but I have had restlessness till it made me almost mad," unquote. And once a woman started using morphine advised by her doctor, she could then buy as much as she wanted at the drugstore. Even young teenagers could buy morphine. Drugs were entirely unregulated, and addicts required stronger and stronger doses. This dark side is revealed in some of those Belle Epoque arts with the portrayal of women. This painting that you see is called Morphine Addicts from 1887. Next slide. And this one is called Morphine Addict, and it is from 1897. The hypodermic syringe invented in the 1840s made morphine use even easier. The wife of the doctor who invented it became addicted to morphine. Next slide. One of the first women of Muncie that I started researching as a notable figure during the gas boom beautiful age was Anna Lemon Griffin. She was a surgeon in Muncie in the 1890s. In 1896, Anna was a respected member of the mostly male Delaware County Medical Society. The newspaper reported that her anatomical descriptions were of high order and her specialty was the skull and its contents. Dr. Griffin operated offices on Charles Street, Franklin Street, and here at the 20th Century Flats that you can still see on North Jefferson Street. Next slide. In 1903, after 8 years of marriage to William Griffin, Anna filed for divorce, charging her husband with neglect, cruelty, and adultery. Dr. Griffin's divorce was denied. In 1905, William filed for divorce. William alleged that Dr. Griffin threatened to operate on him, declaring that he was continually haunted during the latter part of his marriage with the fear that his wife would chloroform him while he slept or kill or maim him to torture him using her surgical instruments and skills. At the divorce trial, William's daughter, Anna's stepdaughter, described an alleged incident where Dr. Griffin entered William's room and threatened him. "Now blank blank you, I have you and I will get you this time." Newspapers around the country picked up the scandalous story. At the trial, William Griffin claimed that Anna was addicted to morphine for at least the last 5 years. Dr. Griffin did not appear in the court to defend herself, so the divorce was granted. Her reputation as a doctor was destroyed. Next slide. Then in 1906, Anna was detained by police in Kokomo after she couldn't pay the bill for a boarding house. Dr. Griffin told police her husband was stalking her and that she was afraid. Quote, "There's not been an hour in the last 5 years that I have been sure someone was not spying on me, reducing me to the nervous wreck that you see," unquote. Authorities sent her to the state mental hospital in Logansport. Her condition was reported in the 1906 American Medical Association bulletin as temporarily deranged. The truth is muddy in this situation. We've all seen this movie before where in a he said, she said account, the man's word is considered true and the woman is considered crazy. So we can't be certain if Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin was in fact addicted to morphine, but it is entirely possible. Next slide. It's possible because the opiate epidemic that was happening was affecting doctors who were prescribing morphine to women, but also likely taking it themselves. So Anna Lemon Griffin fit into both categories of the addicts. Next slide. During this time, regular users of opiates were accepted in their communities. They were not considered deviants, though most women did keep their drug use secret, just as they did the rest of their private lives. Although medical journals and newspapers warned about these addictive drugs, demand for morphine from wealthy patients and competition from other doctors and pharmacies led to the epidemic. Local sanitariums even promised easy relief. Bad habits meant big business. Next slide. As advertisements for so-called patent medicines in Muncie newspapers promised relief from pain, nervousness, impotence. Before and after images were dramatic. During the 1890s, the Sears and Roebuck catalog offered a syringe and a small amount of cocaine, morphine, or heroin for $1.50. Next slide. Even babies and children were doped with opiate-based soothing syrups for coughs and for teething. Next slide. Gas boom era Muncie newspapers were littered with stories about women overdosing on morphine, either accidentally or otherwise. Who were some of the women, this sinister sisterhood, who were affected by this dreaded epidemic? The first woman mentioned in the Muncie newspaper for using morphine was a 13-year-old from Winchester who overdosed on the drug in 1879. Like so many of the opiate overdoses of today, many of the victims accidentally took too much of the drug or mixed it with alcohol. Loved ones would discover a syringe and assume the motive was suicide, not realizing that the victim was an addict, reusing the same needle over and over again. Next slide. In the case of Ada Luth, a regular user, her attempt to self-medicate proved nearly fatal. House calls for stomach pumps were common during this time in Muncie. One resourceful addict was taken to that sanitarium on Walnut Street by her husband, but the woman didn't have any symptoms of withdrawal after several days. It was discovered that she had hidden 6 weeks worth of morphine in her thick hair. Next slide. Daisy Thomas, who was only 17 years old, overdosed on morphine after an argument with her suitor, fighting off her sister with a syringe. Stella Stillwater was thought to be near death after she, quote, filled herself chock full of morphine, surrounded by needles and beer. But turns out she was just imbibing for fun. Next slide. In 1891, 2 Muncie women were arrested for prostitution. Lily Rowe and Mamie Fisher, who went by the alias Anna Oakley, actually stopped at the Star drugstore on their way to jail and purchased cigarettes and morphine. In their cell, they each wrote a letter and then took half of the morphine in an apparent suicide attempt. The newspaper was less than compassionate about this unsuccessful attempt of these working women, saying that they wouldn't be mourned. And quote, Oakley is a confirmed morphine eater, which accounts for the drug not doing its work, for they evidently took enough to end any ordinary mortal. The pair still live and we will be out in a few days, leading their usual life of depravity. Next slide. A more typical story of women addicted to Muncie women addicted to morphine is the tale of Miss May Holder in 1906. May was from a prominent family, but was arrested for shoplifting at a downtown Muncie store. 8 years earlier, May's baby had died and her husband divorced her. A doctor gave her morphine for relief. Quote, her condition was extremely serious and it was necessary for her to keep continually increasing the dose. And now she takes enough at one dose to kill several men, unquote. A doctor prescribing morphine to ease emotional anguish led May Holder and any number of Muncie women down this road of addiction and subsequently crime or even death. Next slide. In another Muncie case, cocaine was the destructive culprit. The Muncie Evening Press described how cocaine, unlike morphine, produces pleasant sensations, inspiring courage, but it is a swift road to destruction. The article told the story of a young, prosperous attorney who relied on cocaine for his work. His wife secretly began using his stash. In the end, quote, "Today, one is a raving maniac and the other is behind bars, clamorous for cocaine," unquote. Next slide. Just after the turn of the century, the demographics of the, quote, drug fiend were changing. More young men and African Americans were using opiates. Coincidentally or not, that's when laws changed. By 1905, Congress was enacting legislation that regulated or banned the use of opiates. Drug labels were required to list ingredients by 1906. And now the newspapers describe the drug habit as revolting and sickening. By 1910, even with legislation and more restrictive prescriptions, the number of opium consumed per person had doubled in a 40-year span. Next slide. Most of those so-called patent drugs were flushed out of the market due to these new regulations, especially related to illicit ingredients. But some products, like Coca-Cola, which originally was made with cocaine, survived. And sadly, so too has addiction. The current opioid crisis reminds how history repeating itself can be sinister and deadly.
Thanks, Melissa. That was definitely a dark tale from Muncie and Delaware County history. I was kind of well, if anyone has any questions, like we always do at the end of each session, segment, if you want to go and put them in the chat, that would be great. I do have just a kind of question I was thinking about. Why was it so common for women to use opioids during the gas boom era?
It's kind of interesting that during this time period, we know about social reformers and suffragists and the temperance movement that was big with especially high society women. And for them, it was considered disrespectful or not proper to drink alcohol. So when they had any kind of emotional issues or nervousness or any kind of even just a headache, anything from menstrual cramps to even morning sickness for pregnant women, their doctor would prescribe them morphine because that was considered more acceptable. So it's kind of interesting. I read, there's a book, I have the copy of it. I mentioned it. It's David Courtwright, and there's a copy here at Bracken Library. It's called Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction. He's written a couple of books about drug addiction, and it's really interesting. Like Jane Addams admitted to using morphine, Louisa May Alcott. So there were a lot of that era women who were reformers, writers, artists that were using morphine that was prescribed by a doctor. And that was the source for the addiction, was a doctor's original prescription. And then the women would just self-medicate.
Okay. Well, we do have someone put a comment in. Just a comment, I'll read it very quickly. Wow, I work in public health, and opioid addiction is a major problem in Delaware County right now. I'm amazed to learn this history. So, well, welcome. Thanks.
Oh, and I'm going to put in the chat, Dr. De Silva's class has been.
Oh, she already did it for you.
Oh, okay, good.
It's already in there.
They've been researching the gas boom era for years. So there's a really nice video about Dr. Griffin, if anyone wants to watch that.
Okay. Well, we don't really have any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter, who is Karen Vincent.
Thanks, Sarah. This is a tale of two bodies found at the old Muncie Central High School that was located on High Street in downtown Muncie. And I first heard these stories just about as soon as I entered the building as a sophomore. After all, you know, how many high schools can claim stories of a body found in the basement and another body found in the attic? Next slide, please. Pearlie Gulsby Hogg disappeared without a trace on Thursday, December 21st, 1922. That morning, he left the home where he lived with his Aunt Minnie and Uncle Charles Cooper on North Brady Street and headed to the downtown school about 1.5 miles away. Mr. Cooper told the newspaper that Pearlie was a little late that morning, but told his aunt he would run to school and get there on time. He seemed in good spirits, and his actions were not the least unusual. Next slide, please. Perley had told his aunt that he would probably be late getting home because he was going to his job of delivering groceries right after school. That was the last time that Minnie and Charles saw Perley alive. Perley was born April 5th, 1907, near El Dorado, not too far from the Mississippi River in southern Illinois. One morning, just a few days before Perley was born, his father, Ben Hogg, told his wife that he was going out to cut some wood. He didn't return that day and was never seen again. Perley's mother died when he was very young, and he eventually ended up with his mother's sister Minnie and her husband in Muncie, and two other aunts also lived in Muncie. According to one newspaper article, Perley had a sister, but by the time his body was found, her whereabouts were unknown. In Muncie, Perley used the name Goldsby, his mother's maiden name, rather than Hogg. After Perley's body was found, Charles told Muncie Evening Press reporter John Llewellyn that he and Minnie weren't concerned when Perley wasn't home by the time that they went to bed. The next morning, though, when he still hadn't come home, Charles reported his absence to the police, but they didn't, Charles said, make much of an effort to find Perley. Charles also said that he advertised for Perley's whereabouts and followed every possible clue trying to find him. The uncle wasn't the only person looking for Perley. Carrie Dunn, the truant officer, heard a rumor that Perley was working at a bottling plant in Upland, so she went there to check out the story. Perley obviously wasn't there. Maybe Perley had run away. According to several sources, Perley talked about quitting school and leaving home when he was 16. Others mentioned that he talked about running away and joining the Navy. Muncie policeman Floyd Privet recalled a conversation with Perley where the boy talked about being tired of life at home and that some of these days you will find me in the stone quarry. Effie Owens, another one of Perley's aunts, said that she had seen Perley about a week before he disappeared. At that time, she said that he told her that she would never see him again because he was going to run away or commit suicide. Mrs. Cooper contradicted these statements, saying that Perley was satisfied with his living conditions and that he had never mentioned running away. His Aunt Minnie and Uncle Charles also said that they had a peaceful home life and that they didn't mistreat Perley. After a while, life went on for the Coopers, the truant officer, and school officials and students, and Perley was pretty well forgotten. Next slide, please. This is a memoriam page from the 1923 Muncie High School yearbook. And even though Perley was among the students that died that school year, obviously he didn't get recognition. And I must admit, I just like this image, so I had to include this slide. Next slide, please. So fast forward 9 years to July 9th, 1931, when 3 plumbers were working in the air shaft in the basement of the high school. Otto Armstrong, shown in the middle, kept walking on something that he thought was a brick. When he turned a light on the brick, he realized that he was walking on a human skull. He shined a bright light around the floor and saw more bones and bits and pieces of clothing. Armstrong and the other men with him hoisted the dismembered skeleton through an opening to the basement floor. Along with the skeleton, the plumbers found 2 teeth, a knife, regulation army shoes, and part of a magazine or brochure. Next slide, please. So where exactly was Perley found? Here you see the floor plan for the first floor of the school with the boys' bathroom highlighted. The air shaft that opens out of the restroom extends from the 3rd floor to the basement, so he could have entered the shaft on any one of the floors. The photo shows the boys' restroom shortly after the school was built, right around 1914. The entrance is probably what you see at the right of the photo. A little area inside the door was usually used as a janitor's closet, and behind that was the entrance to the shaft. Next slide, please. From the found articles, along with some tufts of hair, Charles Cooper and Effie Owens identified the skeleton as Perley. So did Roger Mayer, Perley's employer. So how did Perley make it to the air shaft and how did he die? There were lots of theories ranging from accident to suicide to murder. Most people, it seemed in newspaper accounts, leaned towards suicide or murder, although the accident proponents were also heard from. To take these one by one, we'll start with accidental death. It seemed that the janitor's closet entrance to the air shaft was a popular place for students to take a cigarette break. So perhaps that's what Pearlie had done and accidentally stepped into the shaft. That theory was almost immediately debunked when several people noted that Pearlie didn't smoke. It may have been an accident, but not because he had to have a cigarette. The many more people who went with the suicide theory were led by Patrolman Floyd Privet and Coroner Clarence Pifo. Privet said that he thought Pearlie had stayed after school and while hanging around got the idea of suicide. And Privet said, when he came on one of the corridors leading to the shaft, thought he would commit suicide by jumping down. Throughout the initial phases of the investigation, Coroner Pifo also held to the suicide theory. Next slide, please. Pearlie's Uncle Charles was convinced that Pearlie was murdered, as were a few others. Apparently, sometime before Pearlie disappeared, there was a fight between a teacher and some students that might have played into Pearlie's death. An unidentified boy told Aunt Minnie that several boys had beat up a teacher and that the teacher threatened all of the boys, and especially Pearlie. Next slide, please. In October 1931, Coroner Pifo filed his report on the case with the county clerk. In his report, Pifo wrote, "How he met his death or why has not been determined. The police department of Muncie, Indiana are still investigating." According to the newspaper article in the Muncie Evening Press, filing of the verdict closes as far as the coroner is concerned, the investigation of probably the most baffling case that police have been called on to solve in many years. Pearlie was laid to rest at Elm Ridge Cemetery in Muncie. And so it stands. We still don't know exactly how Pearlie died. Next slide, please. It's possible that the next story began in February 1948 when house painter Nelson Wimpy Dull suffered a leg injury when he was hit by a car. It definitely ended in April 1948 when the 34-year-old Wimpy's lifeless body was found in the attic at Central High School. Wimpy left his home on South Liberty Street at about 1:40 a.m. on Friday, April 13th, or Saturday, April 14th. Accounts vary. He told his wife that he couldn't sleep and that he was going out for some fresh air. About 13 days later, and 5 minutes away from his home, he was found. Next slide, please. On the morning of Monday, April 26, 1948, teachers and students at Muncie Central noticed, as noted in a Muncie Evening Press article, a discomforting odor throughout the building. The hunt for the source of the odor commenced, and as it got stronger, students were dismissed from school. Next slide, please. At about 11 a.m., high school janitor Aramis Joris, who was teamed with assistant principal Harold Anderson for the search, found the source of the odor when he opened a hatch door on the roof. A body, soon identified as that of Nelson Wimpy Dull, either nude or clad only in an undershirt, again, accounts vary, was found lying next to a joist in an unused portion of the attic on the southeast side of the building. The body was about 18 feet from the hatch door. The height of the attic at that point was only about 4 feet. Joris told reporters that several times the previous week, when he looked up a shaft leading from the boiler room to the roof, he had seen a man looking down at him, but he said that he thought little of it. Next slide, please. A pile of clothing, including a brown hat, brown pants, red check shirt, and black leather jacket, was found about a dozen feet from the body. Wimpy's brother, Max Dull, identified the body from the clothing. When Dull's wife reported him as missing, she had described these pieces of clothing and also noted that Wimpy was wearing a silver ring and an identification bracelet. The ring and the bracelet were not located at the time the body was found. But about a week later, in another search of the attic, Coroner Eugene Eisman found the ring and the bracelet along with a horseshoe token, a sock, and a shoe. The items were scattered as far as 120 feet from the body's location. A straw hat torn to shreds was also found in the attic. In addition, several food containers were found near Wimpy's body, leading to the theory that he had been living in the attic several days at least. Wimpy's family dismissed this idea, saying that he was reliable and had never been away from home for long without letting his wife know his whereabouts. By Wednesday, April 28th, chemical analysis of Wimpy's vital organs was completed. No barbiturates or anything else that might have caused death was found, and according to Coroner Eisman, there was no physical evidence of foul play. He planned to continue questioning family members and friends. Questioning by the police did reveal one strange story. Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Driscoll told Detective C.W. Ertl that they had seen Wimpy when standing in front of a tavern on West Main Street about 9 p.m. on April 17th. The Driscolls and Wimpy did not speak to each other that evening, and no one else reported having seen him. Next slide, please. About a week after the body was found, an article in the Muncie Evening Press posed a number of theories about Wimpy's death. Did Wimpy get lost and disoriented in the dark attic, unable to find the hatch? Because Wimpy had reportedly been ill for several days before he disappeared, did his mental and physical health collapse? Did he pound on the floor of the attic trying to attract attention? To this note, Wiley Carter, a school employee, said, "A man could have pounded all day up there without being heard." Or did Wimpy remember the hatch door from his days at Central and climb to the roof to get to the attic to take a nap on the night that he disappeared? How did he climb up to the roof with a leg injured from an earlier accident? Was he unable to find the hatch door when he awoke in the dark? Or after scrambling around in the attic, did he simply lay down to die? Next, please. Answers to these questions were never found, and Nelson Wimpy Dull was buried at Hopewell Cemetery in Farmland, Indiana. And that was it. 2 dead bodies found at Central, one in the basement and one in the attic, and no resolution for either death. I do have one other very brief found in the basement story. Searching for information about Pearlie and Wimpy, I found a story in the February 13th, 1970 edition of the Muncie Central newspaper, the Munsonian. It gives a brief account of the 2 deaths and then mentions the mystery of the headstone. Apparently, at one time, there was a child's headstone stored in the school's basement, but according to the story, the headstone had recently disappeared. It was also noted that the opposite side of the headstone read Muncie School No. 1, 1856. The author of the article assumed that the cornerstone for the older high school was made from this headstone. That couldn't be, however, because the older school wasn't built until the 1870s. Muncie School No. 1 was Washington School, which was built in 1856. So how did the headstone / cornerstone end up in Central's basement, and how did it disappear? I don't know, but I do know where it is now. Somehow it made its way from the school basement to a storage facility on South Walnut Street to a warehouse on Ball Corporation property to the Delaware County Historical Society. And here it is. Unfortunately, so far, I haven't found any documentation about how it landed there, and I'm still working on this mystery.
Thanks, Karen. I guess I was just wondering, I mean, there seems like foul play for sure. I can't in both of these stories, but I was just wondering, what do you think happened?
You know what? Having read all the newspaper articles, I go with possibly foul play. In Pearlie's case, it could have been a bunch of boys just messing around and something happened to Pearlie and everybody was too scared to say anything. I think Nelson Dull is a little different because how in the world did he get in the attic? Did he break in the school and climb up? Did he climb up the fire escapes? It's a puzzle.
Jennifer asked in the chat, does the stone actually have the additional carving on the back?
Yes, it does. It does. And if you can see on the article, it does say that the name is chiseled out, and you can tell on the back of this word that's definitely something's been chiseled out. And while you can't read all the words really well, I can read the part that says age 17 months and 5 days.
Just to go back real quick, we did get a question for Melissa's section. Jacob asked, how were women able to transition from this phase in history to where they are now?
It was mostly from the legislation that was passed by Congress. So national legislation restricted who could be prescribed morphine. And then they started doing medical testing, and they found around 1910 that babies could actually die from morphine. And so a lot of mothers and interested women became a little more aware of morphine and its effects. So that probably did the most.
All right, thank you. We're going to go ahead and go on to our next presenter, Sara McKinley.
Thanks, Sarah. If you want to go ahead and go to my first slide, please. So have you ever heard, or excuse me, have you ever noticed something in the night sky that couldn't quite possibly be explained? Strange lights that moved in unusual patterns or seemed to hover motionless and then disappear. You're not alone, and there are plenty of stories from Muncie's past of strange lights and objects in the night sky, some with very rational explanations and others that left some experts scratching their heads. You may be familiar with Steven Spielberg's 1977 blockbuster movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, starring Richard Dreyfuss as Roy Neary. The character of Roy lived in a very fictionalized version of Muncie, Indiana, even sporting a Ball State University t-shirt in one scene, and his close encounter with a UFO happened on the familiar road, Cornbread Road. The choice of Muncie as one of the settings for the story was very fitting, as just a few years prior, UFO mania gripped this East Central Indiana community. Next slide. But let's back up first to the 1960s, when the first UFO was reported in Muncie newspapers. In 1965, state police investigated a report of a UFO hovering over Muncie. 4 teenage girls reported to police an object hovering over the C&O railroad tracks in Northeast Muncie. They described the object as a basketball-sized pinkish-orange sphere with 1 or 2 lights hovering over and along the tracks before suddenly making a 90-degree turn to the north. Police found no evidence of the object and made the girls' parents sign statements that the girls were, quote, not usually disposed to telling tall tales. Authorities didn't believe the object was related to a recent UFO sighting in Dayton that had been identified as Navy balloons, so the object was officially recorded in the reports as an unidentified flying object. The following year, Delaware County Sheriff's Department received 3 calls in one night about a UFO near Red Key, described as 3 objects with red blinking lights. No official explanation was reported in the newspaper for this one either. Next slide. 8 years later, in October 1973, Muncie was briefly gripped with UFO mania. It began on October 9th when hundreds of witnesses in northern Delaware County saw mysterious multicolored lights and objects traveling over Eaton and near Red Key. An unconfirmed report claimed the objects were tracked briefly on radar 50 miles north in Fort Wayne. However, Delaware County Air Traffic Control and a pilot who went up for a closer look were unsuccessful in spotting the objects. Ultimately, it was theorized that the objects were lighted weather balloons blown by the wind. A few days later, the local newspaper printed a story on October 13th about shipyard workers in Pascagoula, Mississippi, who claimed to have been abducted by, quote, silvery-skinned creatures with big eyes and pointed ears, end quote, and taken aboard their UFO. Later that evening, Indiana National Guard helicopters seen flying in formation at night over Delaware County prompted calls to local authorities reporting UFOs. The next day, a woman in Dayton, Ohio, claimed that, quote, an oblong object with blinking lights killed 2 cows when it landed in her field. Over the next several days, local police answered more calls with reports of UFOs and strange encounters. A Mrs. Pierce reported that a UFO had landed behind her home, and a woman living across the street from Mrs. Pierce reported a loud clicking sound at the same time. Patrolman William Kirby was at the scene and said, quote, "That lady did see something because she was terrified." It was also rumored that someone called the police station to report an incident near Wheeling saying, quote, "There are people out here that are not people." Next slide. All through the month of October, police answered calls about UFOs. When the Muncie Mall hosted an annual Halloween costume contest and parade, the newspaper reported that the current UFO reports inspired some, quote, "outer space outfits." By the time Halloween passed, the hysteria had mostly died down, but not before the North Dairy Queen got in on the fun and posted this advertisement saying a UFO had landed there and to stop by for horrible creature sundaes and a free horror pet. The following year, nuclear physicist Stanton T. Friedman gave a lecture at the L.A. Pittenger Student Center at Ball State titled "Flying Saucers Are Real." After 15 years of study and investigation, he was convinced that UFO spacecraft were real and that creatures from outer space have been sighted on the ground. After addressing skeptics with photos of UFOs, reports, and theories, many doubters reportedly left the lecture as believers. Next slide. 2 years later, a group of 10 mysterious strangers visited Muncie who were providing information on where they believe UFOs come from and why they visit Earth. 2 men from the group, Roger and Glenn, spoke about their beliefs to the newspaper office and explained they followed the mysterious The Two, who were convincing people to leave their homes for the prospect of being picked up by UFOs to be taken to the kingdom of the heavens. Their flyer stated they were in Muncie to hold a meeting to clarify, quote, "the evolutionary level above human as originally presented by The Two, and to explain UFOs, where they come from, why they are here, information revealing the intended purpose and true potential of a human," end quote. They believed they were one with the creatures who fly UFOs and who look down on Earth and protect their followers, and that they would soon be taken away from Earth by a UFO. If this sounds familiar to any of you, these were actually members of what was later known as the Heaven's Gate cult. The cult was founded by Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite, known as the Two, or Ty and Doe. They founded the order just 2 years before their members visited Muncie. In 1997, 39 cult members would ultimately participate in a mass suicide event in Rancho Santa Fe, California, coinciding with the approach of the comet Hale-Bopp. Each person was found wearing black clothing, new black Nike tennis shoes, and covered in a square of purple fabric. None of the members were apparently recruited from Muncie. Next slide. Over the next few years, reports of UFOs were fewer and further between, and usually a rational explanation could be found. In 1977, for example, an object with red, green, yellow, and white lights hovering in the sky turned out to be a small piece of tinfoil stuck in a high tree limb, reflecting colors from nearby neon signs. In 1979, a UFO reported buzzing over Muncie turned out to be nothing more than a plane with a sign in tow advertising a Muncie Lounge's special on steaks for $3.95. In 1980, a strange glowing gas cloud was reported as a UFO. The cloud was said to be caused by the launching of a missile by an Air Force base in northern Florida. Next slide. Then in 1987, Floyd Creech published several articles about UFO sightings in the Seen and Heard in Our Neighborhood newspaper column of the Muncie Star. He first interviewed a couple who had claimed to see UFOs in eastern Delaware County and Randolph County numerous times in the 1980s. A young housewife and mother of 2 living south of Parker City said she first saw a UFO on August 9th, 1983. She said, quote, "My husband was gone on a business trip and I was driving home about 11 p.m. with my infant son when I saw this object as I came up over a hill. It was in front of me to the right and followed my car. I watched it for about 10 minutes. It frightened me. It was different from the others, round with 3 red and 3 green lights and spirals like confetti hanging out of the bottom. It would stop and hover, then it zipped away," end quote. She said she sighted another UFO in April 1987, again while driving home on Indiana 32 east of Muncie. She ran to the house afterwards, excitedly calling for her husband to come outside to see the object. Her husband said, quote, "It was across the street about a quarter mile, a bright light, white light down low over some trees. It was a quiet night, but there was no noise. It was really eerie. I got in the back seat of the car and my wife slowly drove down the road from our house while I watched. It stayed parallel with the car and I felt my hair was standing straight up. I got out of the car to watch and it passed over our car with the lights off, but I could make out a faint shape. We saw it off and on later that night. It seemed to be cigar-shaped with a white light in the center. It moved around, changed directions, and made jerky, erratic movements. Then it took off towards Muncie at an incredible speed and disappeared in about 2 seconds. End quote. The wife said she had also seen an object follow her car on her way home multiple times. On one occasion, the object came down from the sky in front of her. She said it appeared to be 3 stories high, and when she blew her car horn, it flew away. Another time, she called the sheriff's department when she arrived home, and she claimed that after the deputy came and observed the object, that he called in with a report that there was something out here. She went on to say that he turned off his headlights, and when he turned on his red flashing lights, the object reacted. She claimed to have then called an Indiana National Guard office who reported having no aircraft in the area, and called an Indianapolis radar control office, which reported nothing detected in the area. The radar office gave the woman the telephone number of a UFO reporting line in Seattle, Washington, which sent her a questionnaire to fill out and return. She was later contacted by a representative of the UFO Center. Floyd Creech, the author of the newspaper article, spent several hours on a clear night at the couple's residence, hoping to witness the strange lights, but saw nothing. Next slide. The following month, Mr. Creech reported again on the UFO sightings southeast of Muncie, but this time his report included a Muncie man's proposed explanation for the reports of mysterious objects in the sky. Irvin Davis's 7-page letter described a report from a coworker who stated he saw a UFO that looked like 1 or 2 people could fit inside. It had 2 small wings in the front near the nose and something like wings along the side that were thin, but so thin it didn't look like a craft should be able to fly at all. It passed low over the barn while he was feeding his animals, and his dog barked at it. It didn't have propellers or jet engines, and it only made a humming sound, possibly from the wind passing over it. Davis found no reports of flights in the area at that time and ruled out frequent low-level flights by A-10 jets from Grissom Air Force Base or National Guard helicopters. He also ruled out a common teenage prank that was sometimes played on county roads, in which teenagers wrapped a large rubber doll in foil and attached fishing lines to it so it would hover over a road. When car lights shined off the foil wrapped doll, they'd pull the string so that it would ascend rapidly in the sky, leaving the drivers wonder what they saw. Davis concluded that UFOs must be an experimental stealth aircraft like the MP-18 Dragon, which had been featured in a 1986 edition of Air Combat magazine. The craft could reportedly avoid radar detection by about a quarter mile, or beyond a quarter mile, could hover, fly backwards, forwards, and sideways, up or down, and zoom off at incredible speeds. But why would anyone choose the Parker City, Selma area southeast of Muncie to test such an expensive experimental aircraft? Whatever the case, Davis said, quote, "One thing is for sure, if UFOs originate outside our Earth, what the heck is around here worth their interest? Just tuning into our TV or radio frequencies would seem enough to ward off even the most earnest visitors from any far-off location. In fact, if I were a UFO occupant and noted all the hostilities on Earth, I'd just place a detour sign out in space to alert other space travelers to find a more peaceful study group." End quote. After this report in 1987, the Muncie newspapers didn't seem to report on any new local sightings of UFOs. So did visitors from outer space decide that Davis was right and that we weren't worth visiting anymore? Or perhaps we all look to the sky with a more skeptical eye. Whatever the case, objects in the sky certainly have a history of capturing our community's imaginations.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm still laughing at that there are people out there that aren't people quote.
Yeah.
I think that's one of my favorites. But actually, too, I think it's really funny, the quote about the detour sign for the planet. I don't remember if it was an NPR story I had heard, but because the planet has gone to more digital kind of forms of of communication, with our TV and phones and things like that, that the planet has actually gotten quieter, and that it's not as loud with as much radio frequency as it was probably between the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So maybe we have inadvertently put up a detour sign, and they have just they don't think we're here anymore in some way, shape, or form.
That could be. I mean, I know I heard a lot of personal accounts from adults when I was a kid growing up that said they'd had seen UFOs. I had a high school teacher who used to tell her students that she had been followed by a UFO on the highway back in the 80s or 90s. I thought I saw something as a kid that I didn't know what it was either. So I've heard from a lot of people, but I haven't heard very much recently. I mean, you see YouTube videos. And of course, Jennifer Lewis mentioned in the chat, Project Blue Book files are available. And it looks like they're actually available on fold3.com, which is the military records database. So who knows? The truth is out there.
Yeah, the truth is out there. You took what I was going to say. That's so true. The X-Files. Yes, the truth is out there. We want to believe. I also thought too, it was kind of interesting that there was a UFO office that you could call in Seattle, Washington. That would
that was the first that I'd heard of that too.
They
sent a survey,
a survey questionnaire kind of a thing. I just think that that's kind of funny. Okay, if anyone else has any comments or questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. But we're gonna go ahead and move on to our last presenter this evening, who is Nalleli Guillen from Minnetrista.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to join tonight's panel. It's my first with you guys, but hopefully not my last. Unlike some of my co-panelists, I'm actually relatively new to Muncie in Indiana. I'm closing in on my 1-year anniversary at Minnetrista in the next couple of weeks. And because of that, at first, I wasn't sure that I had any really juicy Eerie Muncie type stories in my research Rolodex to share yet. If you'll go to the next slide. However, then I started thinking about the first project I worked at when I arrived at Minnetrista, which was researching some local history tie-ins to go with one of our recent traveling exhibitions called Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns. For that project, I went digging around for some of Indiana's best urban legends, creepy creature stories that are unexplained but persistent, rumors that over time have become myths, that over time have become legends. I wanted to close this out today by sharing some of these Hoosier creature legends from across the state. And I'll talk about just a handful of the little pinpricks that you see on my monster map on screen. Even if these legends mostly can't be verified, you'd be surprised how often some kernel of historical truth is baked into these mysteries. I know I'm going a bit further afield than normal for these programs, but I promise I'll end with a Muncie monster legend potentially in the making. If we can go to the next slide. My first story comes from Fulton County to the north of us, about a lake near Rochester and not far from Logansport. According to newspaper accounts from 1838, that summer, 2 local men fishing on the lake were terrified when some kind of creature broke the waterline near their vessel, swimming past rapidly and measuring over 80 feet in length. 60 feet. It was big, sorry. They rushed back to shore and spread the word far and wide about their unexplained sighting on the water, kicking off several weeks of expeditions as local people attempted to see the creature for themselves and potentially capture it. Can we go to the next slide? The monster of the Devil's Lake wasn't a new story to the region, only to the recently arrived European settlers. The local Potawatomi feared the lake, which they called Manitou, translated to mean the Devil's Lake, because of an evil spirit they called Meshekenebek that supposedly lived in the water. 1838 marked the start of the Potawatomis' forced removal from Indiana by the American government, so there was little trust between them and the Europeans. Native American legends were dismissed and cast off as silly superstitions, including the ones about Meshekenebek. That is, of course, until white men themselves had their own encounters. What might have been a brief and forgettable moment of hysteria made its way into history books because the monster of Manitou Lake got great press coverage. The stories about his sightings made the local newspapers, they made their way around the state. His picture even made it into the papers, as you can see. And the entire story of this monster hunt was preserved by a local artist. If you go to the next slide. Englishman George Winter arrived in Logansport, Indiana in 1837, and his surviving letters show that he was fascinated by the Lake Manitou monster craze and actually documented the local efforts to capture the beast pretty closely. He himself even designed a trap for the hunt, which you can see in this gorgeous and frankly slightly strange watercolor on screen, which is very different from Winter's more well-known portraits and landscapes. In the end, however, it was all for nothing. No creature was captured, clever trap or not, and the mystery remained lurking under the water. Over the next 2 centuries, occasionally new sightings cropped up in the late 1840s, in the 1960s, and throughout the 1970s and 80s. Could there be a Loch Ness style creature in the Devil's Lake? And if there is, or you think there might be, would you go searching? I don't think I would. Would you go to the next slide, please? Moving to the Southwest, while stories of werewolves can be found all around the world, in Indiana, we have our own Hoosier wolfmen whose local legends go back centuries. In the early 1700s, the French began establishing small settlements in the area that is now Southwest Indiana. Its proximity to large waterways, making it a convenient area to conduct trade between French New Orleans and Canada. One second. Sorry. Sorry, my little dog does not appreciate monster stories. As French traders moved into the area, they brought their tales of the loup-garou, or wolf men, cursed shapeshifters, humans cursed to transform into large black animals into the area. Stories of these creatures were known throughout the region, but many persisted and survived near what is now Vincennes. If you can go to the next slide, please. From the 18th century, loup-garou stories were passed down from generation to generation, surviving as oral histories of these French-American Hoosiers. And in fact, versions of some of these early Hoosier werewolves survive for us to hear today because in the 1930s, the US government's Works Progress Administration conducted interviews with older Americans, including many in the Vincennes region, and their loup-garou stories made their way into the official record. One great story dates from just after 1779, when American George Rogers Clark took Fort Sackville near Vincennes from the British. The narrator said, quote, "After that time, plenty of Americans came to Vincennes, and they all the time laughed at us French and our loup-garou stories. They said they weren't true, but pretty soon an American said he lost his cow, and he went out and hunted her every night. Nobody ever found him in his house at night after that. At last, a local Frenchman said to himself, 'Go and hunt the man that's bewitched and deliver him.' So he got his big knife and started out in the dark and hunted hard for the American that he thought was possessed. Well, he heard a cow moan that wasn't far from him, and he thought of the man that said his cow went away. Then he knew it was the poor American that all the time laughed at the French when they told of the loup-garou," end quote. So, are there peculiar wolves or cows or horses in Indiana secretly holding the souls of human men or women inside? There are a lot of large black animals in Indiana, so it's somewhat hard to say. If we can go to the next slide. And just one more creature feature to close us out. We don't need to go back hundreds of years to find Indiana's mystery monsters. Some unexplainable sightings have occurred more recently. For example, in 1949, people in the Whitley County town of Churubusco started whispering about an over 6 foot long and hundreds of pounds turtle spotted in the local Fuchs Lake. Some of stories of this gargantuan snapper supposedly in the region spread like wildfire, making stories across the country. Search parties were formed, divers were brought in, and at one point there was even discussion of trying to seduce the turtle, whom the town named Oscar, by bringing in a pretty lady turtle who might tempt him to come to the surface. Much like the Manitou Lake monster a century before, however, these searches didn't result in the discovery of the rumored beast. Oscar won the game of hide and seek against the people of Churubusco that he had been playing, and by the spring of 1949, they gave up the search and left him be. What's great about this legend, though, is that monster or not, legend or reality, Oscar, otherwise known as the Beast of Busco, has left his mark on this town. Churubusco embraced the story and ran with it, nicknaming themselves Turtletown, USA, and holding a festival every year celebrating all things turtle. What started as a scary story has turned into a family-friendly tourist draw for the town. We can go to the next slide. However, if anyone is interested in potentially reopening this investigation and conducting their own search for the mysterious Beast of Busco, now is actually a really good time to do that because the property where Fuchs Lake is located is currently up for sale. 9+ acres with great deer and turkey hunting potential, a stocked lake, and yeah, potentially a turtle the size of a VW wagon just lurking under the surface waiting. As you can tell, our state is full of legends of creepy critters, ones that may be more myth than actual monster, but that can tell us a lot about our local culture. There are some unexplained Hoosier creature legends that hit closer to home here in Muncie. The UFOs of the 20th century, which we've heard about tonight, the supposed Pukwudgies of Mountain State Park, and even our own local Bigfoot sightings. I'm sure I'll encounter more the more time I spend studying our area, and you never know when a new monster mystery might emerge. After all, last year when I asked my colleagues at Minnetrista about any Muncie creatures that I might look into, the first thing I heard about, weirdly, was Muncie's newly legendary Southside turkey. Next slide, please. Of course, at the moment, this local celebrity isn't really a monster. He didn't really do anything nefarious besides clog up traffic and frustrate our local animal control office. But who knows what this story could become over the years. Maybe it evolves into a mutant turkey the size of a car, terrorizing people on the south side. Maybe the rumors become a turkey dragging children off into the woods. Probably not, but you never know. Eerie stories have a way of sticking around and evolving.
Thank you, Nalleli. That was great. I kept thinking and wondering if the Beast of Busco, wasn't interested in women. How were they going to coax him out using a female turtle? I
certainly
think
didn't. Yeah, it didn't do the trick at the time.
Well, it didn't seem very inclusive either. So I feel like, that it was a little short-sighted on that one. But
sure.
But thank you very much. If anyone else has any other questions for any of the panelists, we are now at the end where we're going to move on to our question section. Our panelists will come back from having their videos turned off and are welcome any questions or comments that you might have this evening. Go ahead and keep writing those questions in that chat box if you've got them. I am good. Oh, just a thank you very much. What great stories from Emily Johnson. Thanks for coming, Emily. I'm just gonna go ahead and move on to the next, kind of the end. So if you do have questions or comments that you'd like to put into the chat, go right ahead. Tiffany Flower says no questions, but I love this whole event. Great content with a happy face. That's very nice. So we are at time. We try and keep them. Does Nalleli have I don't know what that is.
Dachshund. He's a poodle and he's very elderly. And he tires of history. He's been with me throughout my whole professional career. So. It's not his thing.
Someone asked a really good question. Where do you begin your research? That's a great question, I think, for every one of our panelists. If we just kind of want to go down the line real quick. Someone can, we'll go in order. Melissa, you start.
Oh, I have my own addiction and it's to newspapers.com. I highly recommend getting a subscription because you'll find all kinds of really cool stories.
How about you, Karen?
Well, like I said at the beginning, I had heard these stories back when I was in high school. So yes, I jumped into newspapers.com then to find out more about each of them. Plus, there was a video on YouTube came up. It was done probably about 6 weeks or so ago about these two incidents.
How about you, Sarah?
Trying not to sound like a commercial for newspapers.com, but same as Karen. I actually had heard some of these stories and then went digging to see what else I could find. I especially had wanted to find what the earliest and most recent stories were. And then, yeah, so newspapers.com is one of the great resources to look for sort of things on a theme.
Nalleli?
For me, for this particular subject, I actually started with some earlier publications. So there's a book called Weird Indiana that's fun for kind of collating some sort of short snippets on unusual history like this. And I kind of earmarked some stuff that looked interesting and then went digging for more. So the George Winter stuff I actually ran across because the Tippecanoe County Historical Society has worked with Purdue, and they actually have a lovely fully digitized research when it comes to the George Winter collection. So I kind of started with the small stories and then went looking for the chunks, the bigger kind of original documents, and spent a lot of time on newspapers.com.
Emily Johnson has a great question. Does NPL or Minnetrista have a newspapers.com subscription that the public can use?
So
Or
that's an
Society does.
interesting question. The Delaware County Historical Society does, because they are a small institution that can use the individual subscription. But unfortunately, larger institutions have to get the institutional subscription, and Muncie newspapers are not available in that version of the subscriptions. So MPL does not subscribe to it to make it available for the public, since it doesn't have our local newspapers. But our staff do have access, and we can help the public find articles. And then we have all of the newspapers on microfilm here, or we can help print out articles. I don't know about Minnetrista, but
we have a subscription. Our library and archives is open by appointment at the moment, but we do have computers in that space, and I believe we can assist people in logging on if they come to do research in our archives or just in general. I know that's what I use constantly, the institutional subscription that we have, which is relatively new to us. I think we got it this summer, and everyone cheered very loudly.
Another question from Deborah was, do you happen to know why Muncie was chosen for the place for Close Encounters for the movie? Does anybody know?
I don't know personally. I know that they came to Muncie to look for merchandise, and they actually went to I think the bookstore and bought the t-shirt that Richard Dreyfuss wears in the movie. My guess was that it was always just because Muncie was always seen as sort of a typical Midwestern city. I don't know if there's any other reason for that, but
I don't know how widespread, because there is a lot of sort of Muncie, those like 1960s and 70s accounts that kind of spread. I don't know how far wide that kind of local UFO craze was. My assumption had always been that Muncie kind of got associated with that kind of craze at the time, and Spielberg kind of ran with it.
That's actually a really good point, because it just reminded me of something. My very first trip to Disney World, we were on one of the river boats, and the tour guide was asking us, or the riverboat operator was asking us where we were from, and we said we were from Muncie, Indiana. He said, "Oh, that's the place with all the UFOs, right?" I don't know if he was referring to Close Encounters or if he was referring to the actual stories, but I thought that was funny that was the first thing he thought of.
Seth asked, what prompted you to examine the opioid epidemic?
I just thought it was when we started the Notable Women Project, we wanted to make sure that we used the word notable so that we weren't just studying women who had done something good. And so one of the first kind of complicated women that I researched was Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin. And she was alleged to have been a morphine addict and a doctor. And when I looked into it, I realized that I think they said that 60% of the opium addicts at that time were women, and the other major addicts were doctors, and the doctors were the ones that were prescribing the women, and the doctors who prescribed the most were also the ones that were using the most. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting story.
Okay. If anyone has any last minute questions, go ahead and throw those into the chat. I'll just end by saying on behalf of our presenters this evening, we would like to thank you for joining us. We do have a survey that hopefully Sarah will put into the chat like she always says. If you have some time, please take a moment to complete it. This will be our last kind of community presentation for the year. We are not going to do in November or December this year, and hopefully we'll move to more of kind of maybe a hybrid approach in the new year, depending on how things go. If places open back up, and maybe we'll do both a Zoom and in-person kind of presentation, or maybe we'll come up with something brand new altogether. Who knows? It'll be a new year. So we really want to thank you for joining us this evening and for always coming. We have a lot of return attendees, and that's wonderful. And happy Halloween. You know, it's coming up, and happy fall. So have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.